Jonathan Freedland and Melanie Phillips. We're going to be talking today about a subject which, with all due respect to Israel and Jewish diaspora relations and Israel and Palestinian two-state solution, is probably uppermost on many people in this room's mind. And that, of course, is the vote we had here in this country on Brexit and everything that's come about since then. And also fair to say that no matter where people in this room fall on the debate, most definitely the result of the referendum and the events that have come after the referendum have been a challenge to people's way of thinking about this country, about what Britain is, what Europe is, what it symbolizes to the world, and what it will look like going forward. So we're going to talk about that, and of course this is a Haaretz conference, so we're going to bring it right back around to the Jews and Israel, and perhaps as the Chancellor Angela Merkel would say, a little bit of cherry picking to just look at that angle, but here we are in this room. And first let me introduce my guests here, of which I have long bios, but since we have very little time, I'm just going to, I think also these journalists, broadcasters, award-winning authors sitting with me are well known to this crowd in this room. So just to say a few words on their positions and some of the things they've said on this question of Brexit. So first here we have Melanie Phillips, she was a staunch Brexiter, arguing that it's high time Britain left the EU and returned to being, quote, a democratic, self-governing nation. Moreover, Melanie took it further and has argued that a total breakup of the EU would actually be a very good thing for everyone, including, for our purposes here, and for our debate for Israel and for the Jews. Jonathan Freedland thinks a little bit differently. He's been very much in the Remain camp, although he did warn in an article a couple weeks before the vote that the Remain side had not sufficiently addressed the questions and fears about immigration in this country. The ultimate result of the vote, however, he lamented when it was all done, and he said that it was nothing more or less than, quote, the end of this country as we know it.
I didn't write that.
Didn't you?
No.
How embarrassing. That's so embarrassing. Okay. Did you write, Britain has changed in a way that makes the heart sink rather than soar?
Yes,
okay. So, that's terrible. Okay. So, moving right along. Let me start with a question to Melanie. Melanie, many people in London, in Britain, in this room, in Europe, are very worried about what's going on now. People are talking about xenophobia. People are talking about racism. People are wondering what's going to happen with the EU. The economy is taking a hit. And I think that you actually are excited about this moment and the opportunities it holds. Can you talk about that and explain what's exciting?
I never thought I would see the day, having concluded that the politics of Israel were the maddest in the world, that it would actually be exceeded in this country by a political situation which defies every single law of gravity, of political gravity. And we've been living in a complete roller coaster for the last several months, but certainly in the last week. I think many of us in journalism really don't know whether we're coming or going. So it's... We're going. Well, speak for yourself, Jonathan. I fully understand the fears that people have. I'm not exactly the most unfearful person myself. I'm naturally quite cautious. And as a very staunch Brexiteer, I thought there was a very great deal of validity in many of the arguments of the Remain side. And I think many of the questions that we were all grappling with are really still impossible to answer, because we were going to deal with, and we are dealing with a situation which is unparalleled, really. There is no parallel in the world to what the British people have now voted to do. There is no country in the world that is like Britain. And so Britain's future relationship or relationships with the countries of the EU or with the EU itself or with the rest of the world must remain for all of us, at the moment, if we are honest, a pretty open book. And that is a very frightening thing. Freedom is frightening. We know from our own history that when the Jewish people left Egypt, many said, "Why have you brought us here to die in the desert? We would rather be slaves." Freedom is frightening. Freedom involves risk. You don't know what's going to happen. And beyond that, as I say, I think that many of the arguments of Remain had a great deal of validity. Where I think people have exaggerated their reaction, and I think it is an exaggerated reaction because there's a kind of national mourning that's gone on the part of Remain, or many Remainers, I should say. Certainly those who the press, the media, for right or wrong, have amplified in their responses. There is very much a sense of, we've lost our country, it's become something terrible, it's unleashed the demons. And I'm on the other side, so maybe I would say this, but I don't think that is actually justified. I think that part of that reaction is explained by the fact that for a number of people on the Remain side, the position of people who wanted to take Britain out of the EU was identified in their minds with the darkest aspects of human nature, with the most reactionary instincts, with the desire to take the country back to a golden age which never existed, and more darkly, to be rooted in, as you say, xenophobia and racism. I remember when I worked for The Observer, I think very soon after one of its frequent changes of editor, there was, I think, a general election, Labour won, I can't remember what it was, but anyway, and the headline on The Observer, because Europe had been a feature of that election campaign, the headline was "Goodbye Xenophobia." Now, I, at that stage, and indeed since 1975, when I voted to come out of the EU, I'm so old, I'm afraid, that I did vote then, I found myself immediately branded a xenophobe. I found myself branded a dreadful person, not just someone who was wrong, but someone whose views were completely beyond the pale, racist, bigoted. Why? Because I believed in British national self-government, and I didn't believe we could have that in the EU. And I think for people, many people on the Remain side, it seems to me that this aspect of kind of mourning for a country that's become something, not just, they haven't just lost an argument, but the country's become something dark and terrible, is because they see people who have a view opposite to themselves as not being entitled to hold that view, because any view opposite to the view that says we are part of the EU is basically obnoxious. And I find that disturbing.
Okay, and that leads me directly to exactly the question I was going to ask you, Jonathan, which is, was this a vote about racism and xenophobia? Was this a vote about fears on immigration, or can you see that there was a lot more to it? And if the former, what does that mean about the direction the country's going into your...
Well, there's a lot there. So what was the vote about? I mean, it was that people have been debating that for a long time and will be for longer. What was the question? You know, it wasn't just the question on the ballot paper. I think we've got to recognise that. There were some people who had a sort of doctrinal commitment to the principle of being outside the European Union, and they felt the ballot was what it said on the paper, just narrowly that question. There is very good evidence based on, you know, my own reporting and the reporting of many, many others, that in the areas that swung it, and in their millions, which are in Labour-held areas, the argument about the EU, the kind of arguments Melanie and others have been advancing, barely featured. This was an argument about saying, we've had 35 years of being ignored by elites in London, we're economically behind, we're left behind, we've finally got a chance to stick it to the people, the powers that be, and we're going to take it. And that was the way it was seen. And people would say, you know, famously, The Guardian reported somebody saying, you know, in this area, if you've got money, you're for in, and if you haven't got money, you're for out. It wasn't really a question about the finer points of sovereignty and where power should lie between London and Brussels. It was an absolute howl of rage, which I completely agree that the political classes, the media, going back 35 years, had not paid attention to. And I wrote yesterday it was the equivalent of people reaching for an emergency cord on a train they felt was doomed. So I definitely accept that. And and to address Melanie's last point, I don't think you can just say to them they're all wrong. But the reason why people like me, have conveyed to Melanie that we're in a state of mourning is because there's the sense of what has been lost here, and that is pretty quick. To start with something really basic, talking about the country, there is a very real and immediate prospect that the country, as previously constituted for the last 300 plus years, will not exist after this. The people of Scotland voted overwhelmingly, 62 to 38, to remain. Now the country is going to be taking them, they argue, against their will out, and therefore they'll have a second referendum and almost certainly will win it. That already means there won't be a Britain anymore. So for the sake of this notion of British sovereignty, we're actually going to lose Britain. That just seems a bit wrong way round to me. That seems a bit perverse to do that. And that's just the first. But the second thing is, Melanie was saying about the people on the Remain side have exaggerated. You implicitly just now, Melanie, compared the state we were in until June the 22nd with the children of Israel's bondage under Pharaoh. I'm sorry, and you wrote as well, this is a choice between serfdom and freedom. This did not feel like serfdom, I'm afraid. And it's slightly belittling of what serfdom is to suggest Britain's place in a 28-state voluntary union of cooperation and shared sovereignty, which tended to work out quite well in terms of trade arrangements and other things, and yes, absolutely needed some improving, is somehow analogous to a state of slavery. Of course it wasn't. And that was why you led to this sort of Joni Mitchell feeling the day after, which was, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. People woke up the next day and thought, we have now taken ourselves out of this union. There is a great risk, and you just said you would welcome it. Would welcome it, that it could lead to the unravelling of the union itself. Now, to just come to a Jewish point here, how can any Jewish person look with equanimity on this continent, which has known only war and bloodshed for not a century or 2 centuries, but for 1,000 years, with one exception, the 70-year period since 1945, for most of which there was a European Union. The notion that that was just a coincidence and that we can blithely dismantle this one entity that has helped keep the peace in this continent for 70